the first book on this topic that I wrote, Men to Devils, Devils to Men, was trying to reconstruct the history of what the Chinese and Japanese were facing in the China theater at the end of the war. And every country that was involved in World War II in East Asia, whether they can or they can't, whether their budget allows for it, whether they have the legal staff to do it, whether they can get the courts up and running, they all realize they need to have war crimes tribunals of the Japanese because they need to compete with every other country in East and Southeast Asia that's having war crimes trials. So the Chinese see that there's a war crimes tribunal in Tokyo. And of course, they send staff there. They see that there are war crimes tribunals happening in the rest of Southeast Asia by the British, by the Dutch, by even the French in Indochina, and by the Australians. And they realize they cannot avoid having their own trials of the Japanese. But they face several problems. The first problem they face is that China is a country facing catastrophic problems after the war. 100 million refugees, no food, economy is in shambles. The government is in shambles, right? The KMT is there, but of course the CCP is pushing against it, and the Soviet Union has come down from the north as well. And there are very soon 80,000 US Marines helping out in China as well, but somewhat creating more instability in certain major urban areas. So it's complete chaos. And within that chaos, the Chinese are tasked, or they task themselves with finding evidence that hadn't really been procured that much because the Chinese weren't necessarily thinking of their own trials. They were thinking of sending the data and evidence to Tokyo for the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals. But eventually they realized the KMT needs to have its own trials to prove to the domestic Chinese population that a change has occurred, that the Japanese military is out, that Japanese occupation is finished, and that the KMT is back, it's in charge, and it can bring justice to the Japanese war crimes for the Chinese people. So it's paramount for the KMT at that time to demonstrate domestically that it has a handle on justice. It knows how to find and seek out justice for Chinese people. But it's also important for the KMT to demonstrate internationally that it is the correct authority for the proper management of post-1945 China. Because even though Chiang Kai-shek is there on the international stage, not many of the major European and American powers have faith in the KMT. So the KMT, in some ways, are going to use the theater of the stage of war crimes tribunals to demonstrate their understanding of international law, to persuade two populations, domestic and international populations, that the KMT is back and it's in power. In a sense, that's the first problem. The second problem is that there's a huge shortage of staff. The best qualified Chinese legal staff are sent to the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. There is still tertiary staff around China, but everything is dislodged. Right? Where do they hold the trials? Many major buildings are destroyed. And so they have to kind of figure out where and when and how, and what cities and what crimes to pursue, and they need to do this all quickly. The third, I think, issue they face, and this is perhaps what sets KMT Chinese nationalist trials apart from other trials, is they're not vengeful. Chiang Kai-shek declares very quickly in August 16 that the phrase is used later. He doesn't use it in his actual speech, but it's 以德报怨. So they are going to repay Japanese malevolence with Chinese benevolence. In a sense, they're going to be nice to those they've conquered. Now, it's pragmatic. You still have several million Japanese soldiers residing until they get repatriated back home in China. Let's also remember that fundamentally, the Chinese military does not defeat Japan. The Japanese military surrenders and it is defeated, but that defeat is generally to the Allies and mainly to American military power in the Pacific. For all intents and purposes, Japan has not lost. I mean, basically, it loses one battle, but it's fundamentally not lost the war in China. When the Japanese imperial military lays down its arms in China, it is still the main military force. Therefore, Chiang Kai shek and the KMT need to be pragmatic about how they deal with the Japanese, but they also want to treat the Japanese with benevolence because they want to secure a positive post war relationship with Japan. They want to trade again with Japan. Japan is exceedingly important in China's quest for modernity, even after the war. So there are many reasons behind Chiang Kai-shek's choice for this kind of benevolent repayment of Maleb or Japanese violence in East Asia. They face all those problems. And I might make them sound small here, but they're enormous. The KMT doesn't even really get started procuring Japanese war criminals and starting Japanese war crimes trials of the Japanese until after the Americans have done so in Shanghai. So the Americans have trials first of Japanese war criminals in Shanghai who abused and killed American servicemen. And then the Chinese further realized we really need to get things started, because how can we allow Americans to have war crimes tribunals in China? China is now sovereign. So the Americans had kind of neglected the fact that China had fully regained legal sovereignty in 1943 as part of the deal that everyone made so that China would really join the war effort and be treated as an equal. And so America ignores that and has trials in Shanghai, which irritates the Chinese. And there are kind of many other interventions by different countries, the British and the French, all trying to kind of have their own trials on Chinese sovereign territory. And so it's very important for the KMT to delineate what its geographic territory is. What is the territory of China? And one way to also do that is through war crimes tribunals. Because if you think about it, a war crimes tribunal says if you commit this crime here, then it's in our land. If you commit a crime over there, well, that's not our sovereign territory, that's the next country over. And so the war crimes trials also help create or reassert a new geographic map of post-war China in a way that reminds the Allies this is China. So, the political considerations in there are that China needs to show both its domestic population and internationally who's who and that we're in charge now. But it really also demonstrates to the Japanese, at least the attempt by the KMT, is to demonstrate that they are pursuing justice, not vengeance. And it's very interesting to recall, if one doesn't know, that in Japan, at the time, several years after the post-war, there are various monuments and shrines to Chiang Kai-shek around Japan, thanking him and the KMT for the benevolence they showed the Japanese after the war, that they didn't pursue a policy of vengeance, that they pursued a policy of justice, and that the Japanese were mainly allowed to return home and repatriate. So that had a very positive effect. And that effect and that policy will have a huge impact on Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai's policy about their own war crimes trials in 1956.